Hello and welcome to Walk the Talk. I am Shekhar Gupta, not exactly in Delhi's corridors of power, but in a corridor of Delhi's Imperial Hotel for a moment made very powerful by my guest this week, Secretary of Defense from the US, Ashton Carter. Welcome to Walk the Talk.
Thank you, Shaker. Good to be here.
Dr. Ashton Carter.
Thank you. Thank you. As my stepmother used to say, he's not a real doctor. It's physics.
So you are a real doctor with a doctorate. In fact, the reason I kept this introduction so short was that I didn't quite know how to introduce you as a pragmatist, as an intellectual, as a consistent watcher of American security interests now for a very long time. Somebody who served under 11 secretaries, who every party seems to love in America, which is very unusual and which is sort of surprising. Or as a pragmatic, non-ideological Secretary of Defense who everybody loves?
I would say something a little bit different, which is I'm somebody who really deeply cares about security affairs and the fact that without security, people don't get to raise their children in peace, live their lives, dream their dreams. And that's not just true for Americans, but it's for people all over the world. And I'm committed to that, and I've given a lot of my life to that. So it's that commitment, I think, which is central to me.
So as U.S. Secretary of Defense, do you see yourself as being responsible for America's defense and America's strategic interests, or for the whole world's security and stability?
Well, the United States, just because of its history, its size, its power, plays a global role. We have, in particular, and it's not just us, we have friends and allies around the world, of whom India is one. But there's something else, which is not about the United States, which is in today's world, we're all connected. And so everybody needs to be a global actor in one sense or another in order to keep the peace and make a better world for our children.
Because if I read literature coming out of the US right now, this is a big sort of hot debate subject in America. Also, as the country goes for a fresh election, what kind of foreign policy does America need? And one of the new formulations seems to be that America should not be exporting American values, it should just be protecting American interests. So it becomes a bit inward looking.
Well, I think that the United States has a long tradition of recognizing that its interests in the long term can't be entirely separated from the values it's promoting. And so we've always seen the two as related. And I say we, meaning this is, we go into electoral seasons, people debate in electoral seasons, but there's a lot of American foreign and defense policy that continues over decades. One example of that is the U.S.-India relationship. And defense, which I'm defense secretary, tends more than any other part of American life to be bipartisan in the long run. And so it's not as afflicted as other parts of policy are bipartisan. Of course, there are arguments, of course, there are debates and so forth, but there's also a remarkable continuity over decades. I've been doing this for decades and decades for secretaries of defense and presidents of both parties, and not in everything, but in many, many areas, there's been tremendous continuity.
Well, I think you are the very personification of continuity, because you work now with, working with 11 secretaries of defense is something to put on your CV.
That's right.
In fact, it looks so significant that I thought I'll check with you before believing internet on this.
That is true. That is true. And now I work for myself, so that's 12.
But so how does that square with the belief, which I don't think is wrong, that post 9/11, Pentagon is the most ideological part of U.S. government? That, the whole world is divided in black and white, or red and green, howsoever you want to color code them. Enemies, friends.
I don't observe that in the Department of Defense. We deal with the fact every day around the world that the world isn't black and white, that it's very complex and mixed. We deal with that complexity every day. That's one of the things you learn when you're globally engaged, as the United States is, that things are rarely simple, black and white. Now, there are things that are just plain have to be combated and are evil. ISIL, weapons of mass destruction in the hands of terrorists, cyber attacks being used to bring down infrastructure and affect innocent people, terrorism because its target is the innocent. Those things are black and white because they're right and wrong, good and bad, but countries, peoples, regions very rarely divide up so neatly.
So the old line, President Bush's line, that you're either with us or against us.
Well, President Bush was talking in the wake of the 9/11 attacks about Al-Qaeda.
Right.
And that is a reflection of what I was saying about terrorism really is wrong. And he was saying everybody should be against the kind of act that we suffered in New York, but it's not like we're the only country that has had attacks. India has suffered such attacks, the very spectacular Mumbai attack, for example, and that's black and white. That was black.
It was black. So, talking about 9/11, 4 years before 9/11, you wrote a paper, I think, with the then CIA chief on catastrophic terrorism.
Right, right.
Was 9/11 catastrophic enough, or you think you were imagining worse?
My co-author and I have a joke, which is that our paper was the most far-sighted paper ever to be totally ignored. And what we mean by that is, and we weren't the only people writing about the prospect of terrorism, but we were concerned about it through the 1990s as we watched, for example, Al-Qaeda grow, but we were also worried about the fact that more and more destructive power, it's a fact of technology and social change, more and more destructive power is falling into the hands of smaller and smaller groups. That's an objective fact, and we were talking about that also.
So what is it that makes you, what is it that you said in 1997 that was ignored? And that, if it wasn't ignored, maybe would have saved some lives and trouble.
I think that there was simply not the consciousness, at least in the United States before 9/11, of how dangerous terrorism is, how it challenges society because it requires all the different parts of society to work together, police forces.
Also divides society. In a way, good guys, bad guys, suspicion, profiling.
Well, yes, that's something that has to be combated, that people stay on the same side, which is we're all against the terrorists. And so that's another challenge. So it's a challenge to governance, it's a challenge to getting all the instruments of national power together, and this is a global phenomenon, so it's a challenge for international relations.
Let me ask you a trick question. My professor, Steve Cohen, who's now at Brookings, he tells me the problem in Washington is that nobody reads anything that's not marked classified. So was your paper classified?
It was not. I mean, obviously,
That's
my co-author, who had been CIA director, I had been Assistant Secretary of Defense, had been in the government and had access to classified information. We didn't need to use that in writing this paper because the facts were plain for all to see if they only analyzed them. Namely, that the destructive power, once reserved to large nation states and organized groups of humanity, were falling into the hands of smaller, less organized groups of humanity, even individuals.
So you mentioned ISIL and some other manifestations, but you didn't mention Al-Qaeda. You think the threats more or less diminished now?
Well, Al-Qaeda we have been combating since 9/11, but Al-Qaeda still exists. And we're continuing to combat that at the same time we combat ISIL. For example, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is a particular strand of Al-Qaeda which has long been intent on attacking the U.S. homelands, which is something we take particularly seriously.
Right. But do you see ISIL cannibalizing Al-Qaeda, as they seem to be doing with Boko Haram now?
Yeah, there is a phenomenon in which some of the long-standing terrorist groups, some branches of Al-Qaeda, are rebranding themselves as ISIL because they're looking to get more publicity, they're looking to recruit, to raise funds, to motivate their recruits and their adherents, and they think that the ISIL movement adds a certain dynamism to their organization, and so they are rebranding. You do see that around the world.
Yeah, or if I may use that expression, a kind of sex appeal, because ISIL's got territory now.
It has a attractive appeal to both established terrorists and, as we were noting earlier, to people who are just sitting at a keyboard at home, a young person fantasizing about having a different life. A life is more meaningful than the one that they feel they're living. And so it's a very wide variety of motivations all feeding into this evil channel.
You know, Secretary, since we started this de-hyphenation business, we are very conscious not to try and mention Pakistan in any conversation with an important American. But it's very tough for me as an Indian journalist to have come this far talking about Al-Qaeda, ISIL, etc., and not talk about Lashkar-e-Taiba. Because we've seen many promises from the Pakistani side, and definitely from the American side, that all terrorists are the same. But people like me, who are by no means hawks, also believe that Pakistan, even now post-Peshawar, has one view on terrorists in the backyard, or snakes in the backyard, who may bite them as well, and a different one for snakes in the front yard, who they think are under their control.
Let me start with where you started, which is we don't hyphenate. The United States stopped doing that a long time ago out of recognition of the fact that India and Pakistan, while they have a history and a relationship that is frequently very testy, are independent countries forging their own strategic destinies. We want to have independent relations with the two of them. And so we still stay dehyphenated. That said, to get to your question about LET, this gets back to what I said earlier. We need to oppose terrorism in all its form. Whatever excuse is being given, whatever motivation its propagators have. And so the United States does oppose LET.
And have the Pakistanis done enough? Because there's a lot of consternation in India about this LET people getting out of jail, cases not being brought in. Pakistan is now committing terrorists to military courts. Why not LET people? America has a bounty on the head of LET, who roams around addressing meetings along with Pakistan's ministers. It just doesn't fall in place.
Well, we're constantly encouraging Pakistan to do more. And generally speaking, Pakistan has been doing more. And I think it is beginning to dawn on at least some in Pakistan that the dangers to Pakistan itself of sponsoring or being involved or not being aggressive enough in countering terrorism is greater than any potential other motivation for them. And with respect to the particular example you cite, I think the United States and our State Department and our embassy here, not my responsibility to do this, but I think Secretary Kerry and our embassy here have been very clear about our concern about the judicial process with respect to LET.